Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mark Dyson at Rocky Mountain Institute. We're going to kick off in just a minute here. We'll give folks another 30 seconds or a minute to join, and then we'll jump right in. Thanks. All right, hello again. This is Mark Dyson with Rocky Mountain Institute. We're a couple minutes after the hour, so I think we're going to get started. Thanks everyone for joining today. Rocky Mountain Institute's webinar discussing our recent report, A Low-Cost Energy Future for Western Cooperatives. Again, I'm Mark Dyson. I'm one of the authors of the report, and I look forward to talking through what we found and making plenty of time to answer questions from the group as well. So just by way of background, a little bit about Rocky Mountain Institute for those of you who might not be familiar with our organization. We're an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1982 in Colorado. We're still headquartered in Colorado with offices in Boulder and Basalt, but increasing numbers and efforts around the world, and right now New York City, Washington, and Beijing. The topic of today's webinar is the report we released in August called The Low-Cost Energy Future for Western Cooperatives. I've included the URL at the bottom of this slide. You can also just go to RMI's website and search that, and you should be able to find the report. It's 12 pages plus an appendix, and contains details and citations for everything that I'll talk through today. So today what we'd like to do is talk through what are the key messages, the key findings of the report, provide some context and introduction to I guess the broader trends affecting the power industry in the United States, and an introduction to the case study that we pursued as part of this report. Talk through some of the key findings we have in detail, and then their implications for the case study and more broadly for the industry. And then we'll make sure to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the discussion. I would invite folks, if they have questions right now or as I go through the presentation, to type in questions in the GoToWebinar chat box, which you'll find in the app that you open to join this webinar. If you have a question that you want to speak aloud instead of just typing in and having me answer, just note that, and we can unmute you when we have time for questions later. So please feel free to type in the questions or a comment to the chat box if you're having any issues, and we can try to address that as it comes up. But again, looking forward to addressing questions at the end of the presentation. So let's just jump right in then. I wanted to provide right off the bat a summary of the key messages, the key findings of the report. And I'll talk through each of these points, these 5 points in detail throughout this presentation. So first, This project and much of RMI's work is prompted by a recognition that we're in a changing landscape for the economics of energy supply in the United States and globally. In particular, renewable energy prices have come down faster and farther than expected over the past few years in the United States, and particularly in the Mountain West. And we set out to explore the implications and the opportunities that this presents for utilities that are currently reliant on legacy, in many cases, higher cost assets. So our Mountain West case study is an indicative look at TriState G&T and the 43 distribution cooperatives that it serves. And we sought to understand the opportunities at hand, given the new economics of supply in this region, and then also some of the risks present. On the opportunity side, we found approximately a $600 million net present value of cost savings associated with a switch from legacy assets to new renewable energy projects, and I'll talk through the details of that. That's from 2018 through 2030 on a net present value basis. On the risk side, we looked at the risk of rate increases associated with two different energy portfolios, and we found that in a switch to a lower cost renewable energy supply mix, different risk scenarios that we looked at would be between 30 and 60% less. They would have 30 to 60% less impact in terms of rising rates for members than in what we call a business as usual scenario where current assets stay online. So the implication of this, and what we'll talk about at the end of this presentation, is an opportunity for collective action, more broadly between energy providers and their customers to really understand and analyze in minute detail the opportunities presented by the changing economics of power supply, and thereby make rapid progress towards an efficient and equitable energy supply mix. So again, those are the key messages and the key findings of our work. I'll go now into the context of the changing landscape of power supply in this country. So this is a little bit of data from a report we released earlier in the year called The Economics of Clean Energy Portfolios. We looked at the historic unsubsidized costs of utility scale solar, and lithium-ion batteries over the last 10 years. And those three technologies have fallen in cost, unsubsidized, by between 65 and 85% in the last 10 years. And that's shown on the left side of this chart, where each price is normalized to 100 in the year 2017. We looked at analyst forecasts across a number of different groups for the price of those technologies going forward, and found that most analysts agree that each of those technologies could fall another, call it 50% in cost by between 2030 and 2040. And then after we made this chart, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab released its annual State of the Market for Utility Scale Solar, indicating that between 2017 and the first half of 2018, the average PPA price, power purchase agreement price, for utility scale solar fell 46%, almost half in 1 year. So all this to say, there's significant evidence that prices have come down, that's a fact, but that prices will continue to come down for this set of technologies. And that's been the story for at least the last decade. And in particular, the story for solar is quite striking. In the last decade, as I mentioned, the price of utility scale solar has come down on the order of 80%, and nobody predicted it, right? This chart is showing in dark blue the benchmark levelized cost of energy estimate for utility scale solar from Lazard, an investment bank. Each of the lines that are lighter in weight coming off of that main dark line represent an expert forecast in the year in which the line starts for the future levelized cost trajectory of utility scale solar PV. And the implication here is clear. Even the most aggressive experts for the last 10 years have significantly underestimated the cost declines in solar PV. And as a result, many utilities have made investments or made investments over the last 10 years that perhaps made sense at the time, given projections of where renewable energy prices might go. But given the limitation of those forecasts, which this slide is illustrating, the reality today is quite different. So again, we have not historically been able to understand or predict how fast renewable energy prices can decline, and that has led to a current situation where, as I'll get into, there are new opportunities opened up by this emergence of lower cost resources. So some utilities are moving quite quickly to capture these opportunities. So I'll walk through in this chart a few examples that have come up as part of our research and our collaborations over the past year or two. So first, last year, Platte River Power Authority, the G&T serving, sorry, we just got a question. Yeah, the first chart was in normalized dollars per megawatt hour, so not strict. Just to go back quickly, this chart is not in dollars per megawatt hour. It is normalized to 100 in year 2017, but the unit is levelized cost, to respond to that question we got. So to get back into the utility examples, in 2017, Platte River Power Authority published a study that it commissioned looking at the cost for it to go net zero carbon, and found that it could do so at a very low price premium compared to reliance on its existing assets. This study was released well before, I guess, 2 years ago, right, when renewable prices were still quite a bit higher than they are today. We believe that redoing this same study with today's prices would eliminate that cost, that small cost premium that Platte River found in its original study. So Platte River is the first example, also local to Colorado. Nevada Energy this year, and then Xcel Energy this year, both ran competitive procurements for new renewables projects and found that the market was able to commit to record-setting low prices for wind and solar projects. And I'll get into the implications of that in a minute here. But again, two more regional examples of utilities taking action on low-priced renewable energy projects. It's not just in the Mountain West. So Great River Energy is a large generation and transmission co-op serving much of the upper Midwest. Earlier this year, it announced a commitment to 50% renewable energy by 2030, all while keeping rates increasing lower than inflation, and stated unequivocally in its press release announcing this that wind is now the least cost energy resource, full stop, to serve its members. Another non-Mountain West example from recent weeks, an Indiana utility announced it could shut down all of its coal-fired capacity in the next 10 years at a cost savings to its customers. Consumers Energy in Michigan made a similar announcement, committing to, in its latest IRP, to shut down most of its coal capacity by 2030 and all of it by 2040. And then in the last couple of weeks in Colorado, we've seen a number of announcements that have built upon this trend. So first, Holy Cross Energy, a co-op serving the Roaring Fork Valley, announced a commitment to 70% renewable, 70% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. Colorado Springs Utilities, a municipal utility, announced a plan to procure 150 megawatts of solar and increase its solar generation to 20% of its energy by the mid-2020s when this project would come online. And then just the other day, Fort Collins announced a plan for 100% renewable energy by 2030 and a commitment to work with the municipal utility and Platte River to get there. So again, there are many utilities who have responsibility for higher cost legacy assets that are committing publicly to towards a lower cost future built in most cases upon low cost renewables that are now available in the market. So we set out on this project to understand what this opportunity would look like for rural electric co-ops. We chose as an indicative case study co-ops served by TriState G&T. TriState is a member-owned nonprofit organization with 43 members across 4 states, shown here. 1 million end-use customers taking power from those distribution cooperatives. Currently, most of TriState's energy comes from coal. However, 30% of their sales to members are sourced from renewable projects. So our study's focus was essentially to use TriState as a case study of what these market trends that we've seen from other utilities and from independent analysts could mean for the customers that TriState serves. We used only publicly available data for this report, including TriState's own regulatory and lender filings that it makes available, as well as analyst reports from S&P Global and regional utility benchmark data. And I'll talk through what that looks like in a minute here. So the first major finding of our work is that renewables pricing that we've seen in the Mountain West region, particularly in Colorado, beats the operating costs of TriState's 5 coal-fired power plants by, in many cases, a significant margin. So the chart that I'm showing right now is on the x-axis, megawatts of capacity associated with these 5 coal-fired power plants. And on the y-axis, all-in production costs. So these are the cost to produce another megawatt hour of electricity from each of these power plants. This does not include the undepreciated capital costs of these power plants. I'll talk about that in a little bit. This is just looking at the operating costs of these coal-fired power plants. The blue lines, the dashed blue lines, correspond to the range of wind power project bids that Xcel Energy has announced it's pursuing as part of its Colorado Energy Plan that was recently approved by the Colorado PUC. We have added transmission costs as well as integration costs for variable energy to those announced PPA prices from Xcel. So the range that you're seeing here is on the order from, call it $14 per megawatt hour, $15 per megawatt hour to about $21 or $22 per megawatt hour. The orange lines are the corresponding values for utility scale solar that Xcel has announced it's pursuing as part of its Colorado Energy Plan, again, including transmission and integration costs. So a few key takeaways from this chart. One, wherever those blue dashed lines are below the dark blue squares for each coal plant, that means that wind energy is lower than new wind projects are lower than the cost of just fuel purchases to run those coal-fired power plants. So in most cases, wind projects at the benchmark prices we've seen in this region are lower than the cost of purchasing fuel to run these 5 coal-fired power plants, with the exception of Laramie River Station. The other variable component of the other variable cost component of running these coal plants is indicated by the darker red square in each of these coal plant boxes. So in all cases, the cheapest wind bid is cheaper than the full variable operating cost of all of these coal plants. And then the other component of cost that we're looking at is the fixed operations and maintenance. This is paying staff to be on site. This is taxes, basically costs that are required to keep the plant operating, but not necessarily to run it, are in that top bar. And in almost all cases, again, the solar bids that we've seen from Xcel are cheaper than the full go-forward operating costs of these coal plants, again, with the exception of Laramie River. So all that to say, these new resources available in the market that we've seen market data for even inclusive of transmission integration costs, are lower cost to procure than continuing to run or even keep operational these 5 coal-fired power plants. But of course, we recognize that it's not possible to just procure variable renewable energy like solar and wind as a one-for-one replacement of a coal-fired power plant. Wind and solar energy are only available when the natural resource is available versus coal power plants, which can turn on and off to meet fluctuations in demand and provide peak capacity. So to analyze how that would change our answer, we looked at a single coal plant. We looked at Escalante in New Mexico, which is one of TriState's 5 plants. And we looked at 3 different scenarios for providing the energy that currently comes out of Escalante. The first scenario, which is indicated in the left chart, BAU, is continuing to source energy production from Escalante. The second scenario we call fuel saver, so that's keeping Escalante available and operational, paying its fixed cost, but running it less, and instead procuring about half of the energy from wind and solar projects, from new wind and solar projects. And the third scenario we looked at, noted as retirement here, is actually retiring that plant and purchasing wind and solar to provide energy, and then purchasing firm capacity to provide on-peak reliable capacity to maintain reliability on the TriState system. So what I'm showing you in this first chart then is those 3 scenarios, those 3 columns, the energy production in gigawatt hours per year associated with each of those 3 scenarios. So in all cases, we meet the same level of energy production as Escalante currently provides to the TriState system. So the second chart that I'll show you here is resource adequacy, or another way to say this is firm on-peak dispatchable capacity. So in the first case, we get Escalante's capacity worth of resource adequacy, so 247 megawatts. In the second case, we get all of Escalante's capacity, but also the statistically available but very derated capacity at the wind and solar capacity credit of those 2 resources. And what this means is looking at the contribution of those 2 types of projects during system peak, which is why they show up as quite low numbers in that second chart. And then in the third case, we procure resource adequacy not from Escalante, which is assumed to be retired in this case, but from a higher share of wind and solar projects, and then firm capacity purchases, which are the light blue bar. And then the final chart here is how much does that all cost on a $1 per megawatt hour basis. So in the first case, we reproduce here the results I just showed you for how much Escalante costs to run in terms of fuel, variable O&M, and fixed operations and maintenance. That's about $40 a megawatt hour. In the second case, fuel saver, we lower the fuel and variable O&M by procuring wind and solar instead, and we are including transmission and integration costs in these estimates for how much wind and solar cost to procure and deliver. So that's about $35 a megawatt hour. And then in the retirement case, replacing all of the fixed and variable costs of Escalante with wind and solar purchases and then firm capacity purchases, it's a savings of about another $3 a megawatt hour. So the go-forward cost is about $32 per megawatt hour. So again, it's not just energy. We didn't just look at how much megawatt hours cost out of these different resources. We looked at meeting reliability through firm capacity purchases. We sourced data for firm capacity purchase prices from Xcel's 120-day report associated with their Colorado energy plan, and used the median of those numbers for new gas-fired assets. We did not look specifically here at the falling cost of batteries or existing gas-fired assets like Xcel did. So again, this is a conservative case assuming a median price availability of a new gas-fired turbine to meet firm capacity needs to replace dispatchable capacity from these coal-fired power plants. So what does this look like at the portfolio level? That last example was only for one power plant. And At the portfolio level, we looked at two illustrative scenarios. We call them business as usual, which is leaving the current fleet of coal-fired power plants running through 2030, and an energy transition scenario where we constructed an indicative portfolio that retired all coal by 2026 and replaced it with 2.7 gigawatts of large-scale wind and solar projects, and then procured firm capacity, as I was saying, either from new gas-fired assets or batteries or other resources to replace the capacity currently available from coal plants. We also assumed that that TriState would maintain its current contracts with Basin, G&T, and the Western Area Power Administration, WAPA. So in this energy chart, which I'm showing you, or sorry, this is a capacity chart, which I'm showing you right now, illustrates on the left, the business as usual go forward capacity consisting of largely coal, some gas, and Basin and WAPA contracts. And then the energy transition scenario capacity, which retires all the coal, keeps all the gas, keeps all the Basin and WAPA contract capacity, adds new renewables and firm capacity purchases to meet reliability requirements. This is now a generation chart, so energy production in thousands of gigawatt hours per year. So under business as usual, the majority of energy continues to come from coal. We essentially took the latest TriState IRP, including the announced retirements of 2 coal-fired units, and extended the operation of those plants out while meeting the projected load growth that TriState indicated in its recent IRP. The energy transition scenario limits the capacity factor of those coal-fired power plants sooner than they are retired. So the 5 coal assets run less than they do currently as cost-effective wind and solar are procured. That reduces run costs. And then eventually coal production goes to zero and energy comes primarily from new wind and solar, as well as from an increasing use of existing gas capacity, which is increasingly economic due to low gas prices, and again, keeping current contracts with Basin and WAPA. This chart is showing the same comparison, but now looking at revenue requirement. So this is what a utility needs to recover from its customers in order to operate the system and maintain the business. So again, on the left, business as usual, the units here are millions of dollars nominal. Revenue requirement increases. I'll show you what that does to rates in a minute. Basically at inflation. We don't assume things outside of kind of normal inflation and current costs, except for a specific set of capital improvements that we believe are necessary on some of the coal plants to maintain compliance with environmental regulations, existing environmental regulations. Under the energy transition scenario, the coal wedge here, that red wedge, declines significantly as those plants are run less. However, it doesn't go to zero. This is an important point. We assume that revenues from members are still used to pay down the debt associated with the original purchase and investment in those 5 coal-fired power plants. So that's why you see a little tail of light red, again, corresponding to debt payments that are, essentially sunk costs today for these coal-fired power plants. The important point to note here, in addition to that, though, is that even if those debt payments continue, the operational cost savings alone account for $600 million in net present value savings. So using the chart where that comes from is basically looking at the top of the business as usual stack, subtracting out the top of the energy transition stack, and taking a net present value. That number is about $600 million in today's dollars. To put that into concrete terms, if TriState serves about 1 million end-use customers, that number is equivalent to writing every one of those members a $600 check today. So it is a material sum of money when compared to member spend, and also when compared to total system costs to supply power. So this is the last kind of chart and main result that I'll talk through. We, in addition to looking at expected costs, we also looked at risks associated with these two supply portfolios under different risk scenarios, illustrative risk scenarios that we examined. So I'll talk about those risk scenarios. So we considered 8, which are listed on the right side of the slide here, and we quantified 3. We looked at what happens if more members leave TriState, buy out of their contracts and exit the system, as Kit Carson did a couple years ago. The second risk we looked at is what if more members pursue self-generation on their own systems. So this could happen either under existing caps of 5% that TriState imposes on its members, or it could happen under qualifying facility uptake, which is allowed under the Supreme Court's ruling last year or 2 years ago that considered whether or not members, distribution co-ops, should be allowed to procure energy in excess of the 5% cap at their avoided cost under the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, PURPA. The third risk scenario that we looked at is carbon pricing. We didn't specify whether this would be at the state level or the national level. We just looked at 3 illustrative values. We looked so to put numbers to each of those. In the first 2 cases, we looked at 5, 10, or 20% of sales leaving TriState system either due to exit or self-generation. In the carbon pricing case, we looked at $10, $20, or $40 a ton of cost imposed to release carbon dioxide associated with burning coal or gas on TriState system. So I'll talk through the left half of the left side of the chart first. This is showing in blue the expected rate that would be required on average to meet TriState's revenue requirement in 2030. So $86 per megawatt hour, that's 8.6 cents per kilowatt hour, which is, it compares to about $76 or $77 per megawatt hour today. So a slight increase. But then when you add in those risks of member exit, qualifying facility uptake, or especially carbon pricing, those would all increase that revenue requirement, that average rate, by quite a bit. There are 2 mechanisms to talk through here. The first is either through co-op exit or self-generation, the fixed costs of TriState system would be spread among fewer megawatt hours sold, so that the customers who did not leave or did not generate their own power would need to pay a higher fraction of those fixed costs. And in the carbon pricing risk scenario, the mechanism is pretty clear. At the end of the day, TriState's members, if there were such a price, would be expected to pay additional dollars to cover those emissions rights. And because our business as usual case kept most of the coal plants running through 2030, that exposure is quite large. So then we looked on the right side of the slide at the energy transition case where first the blue bar is lower. The base kind of expected value of rates is lower because, as I walked through before, the operational cost savings of switching renewables in for coal lowers the total revenue requirement. But importantly, the risks are lower too. So in the first 2 examples, co-op exits and qualifying facility uptake, this portfolio has fewer fixed costs than the business as usual portfolio. There are contracts, made on a go-forward basis that presumably would require some negotiation if sales didn't materialize, but those are different and fundamentally more liquid than actual steel in the ground and continuing to operate coal-fired power plants. So the fixed cost component is lower in this portfolio, and therefore is less exposed to risks of rate increase through load exit. And then finally, the carbon price exposure is also much lower because on average, the system releases significantly less carbon per megawatt hour in the energy transition case. So again, the summary here, looking at the difference in those sensitivity bars that we looked at, each of them is about 30 to 60% smaller in the energy transition scenario than in the business as usual scenario. So that top line, this transition in power supply reduces the magnitude of rate increases by 30 to 60%. So talk a little bit about what we did that was conservative and some limits to this work. So first, we only had access to publicly available data. We didn't ask for nor did we receive any proprietary data from TriState or anyone else to help us make this more accurate. But that said, we did use the best available public data and indicative benchmarks from across the region to make sure we are representing the situation as accurately as possible. Also, we did not include the most recent 2018 bid prices for renewables that we've seen that are even lower than the estimates we included in our core analysis. We used averaged fleet costs, and what I mean by this is in the scenario work that we did to quantify the total savings potential, we didn't assume that the most expensive coal plants were retired first, which would obviously improve the economics, because we didn't have definitive data on the specific cost breakdowns between those two coal plants. And then finally, we used a resource adequacy focused reliability analysis. And what I mean by this is we looked primarily at the reserve margins required to continue to maintain a peak capacity sufficient to meet load for TriState's overall systems. We benchmarked this against definitive studies both from peer utilities like Excel, as well as Department of Energy sponsored work looking at the entire Western Interconnect and the generation mix that would be required to reliably meet load at the interconnect level. And then finally, we did not include any treatment of batteries in this because the prices are uncertain but moving quickly downward. So we left that out as a conservatism. So finally, I think that this is the last slide, and then we'll move into questions. The takeaway here is that, and this is the only recommendation out of our report, is what we've done is create an illustrative and indicative case study, but one that we believe makes a convincing case that there is a major opportunity at hand. And we were inspired by NRECA's vision here of a consumer-centric cooperative utility that innovates for the benefits of all its customers and uses its scale, scope, and ability to integrate and optimize a portfolio of resources to bring innovation to consumers at lower costs and with fewer risks. So we were inspired by that statement because we think it applies here. There is a fundamental cooperative problem in moving together towards a low-cost future. We know that there are important risks to manage. In particular, some examples we give in the report of actions that make unilateral sense to members or end-use customers or the G&T as a whole, but that at the end of the day might remove money from the system or leave others with more of their share to pay for past high-cost investments. So that is the fundamental risk here that we flag and we believe is addressable through a collective and cooperative action moving forward. So two last things to note here before we move to questions. The first is around open dialogue. TriState, in its press release responding to our study, did invite us to participate in the 2019 Integrated Resource Planning process, which we're excited about and are looking forward to learning more what that might entail. And then the point on transparency here, we are aware of at least one member, one distribution co-op who has asked TriState formally to include a high renewables scenario like the one we modeled in that 2019 IRP process, or perhaps even sooner, and prepare and present those results back to members in a transparent way. So again, these thoughts and opportunities for open dialogue and transparency, we believe, will be important to move forward and really nail down what is the opportunity and how can it be pursued quickly. So with that, I'm going to pause for a second and review some of the questions we've got. If you have further questions you haven't entered in yet, please do so. But again, I'll just pause briefly and review some of the questions and then start addressing them momentarily. So someone on the line flagged that I was incorrect in stating the Supreme Court decision. It was actually a FERC ruling, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I apologize for the misstatement. And that was in regards to the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act interpretation allowing distribution co-ops to procure qualifying facilities at their avoided cost. So again, that was a FERC ruling, not Supreme Court. So there was a question about the production tax credit, or PTC, and the investment tax credit, or ITC. How did those impact the results that I showed on slide 4? So I'm going to switch back to that slide real fast and talk through what that means. I guess the short answer is that these are both historic data and forecast data for the unsubsidized costs. So these explicitly exclude the impact of the production tax credit and the investment tax credit. What that will mean in terms of what utilities can procure is that the fundamental kind of cost trend is downwards, no matter if the subsidies are there or not. However, prices will be lower in the next 2 years before those credits fully sunset than they otherwise would be. So combined with the present environment of low interest rates and access to capital that utilities have, that suggests within the next 2 years kind of an immediate opportunity to seize both the low interest rates and the available tax incentives, which are available to co-ops like TriState through PPAs. There's an immediate opportunity to seize that sooner rather than later. There's a question about the cases we showed for a specific coal plant, looking at the retirement versus the fuel saver case. So the question was, are we assuming a different amount of procurement of wind and solar projects between the fuel saver and the retirement case? And the answer is yes. So we use the same peak capacity credit for each of those resources, but we procure more megawatts in the retirement case to provide essentially the equivalent amount of capacity, or sorry, the equivalent amount of energy as Escalante does. So visually, there's about twice as much wind and solar capacity in the retirement case as in the fuel saver case, as illustrated by the generation chart. And you see here the same relationship, about twice as much resource adequacy or firm peak capacity in the retirement case versus the fuel saver case. There's also a question on what do I mean when I say firm capacity, and just to elaborate on that, in the case of the coal plant or a gas plant, it's essentially the nameplate or the design operating level of that fossil generator. In the case of wind and solar, it's different. It's the average availability during system peak hours, or put another way, the reliable capacity during system peak hours, which is often significantly less than a wind or solar project's full generation capacity. So you can think of this as at 3 o'clock on a summer afternoon, solar is often only generating, say, 20% or 30% of its nominal rating. And so that is the number that utilities like TriState use to assess how much firm capacity can be counted on from wind and solar projects. So there's a question of, in the energy transition scenario, do we model what kind of generation would likely make up new purchases? The short answer is yes, in that we assume that the price paid for those firm capacity purchases is equivalent to what Excel received in a competitive solicitation as part of its Colorado Energy Plan procurement process. That number is $68 per kilowatt year for those of you keeping score. And it's the median price for a new gas-fired project that a developer bid in to Excel's process. We believe that number is indicative of other sources as well, possibly batteries in the next few years or at least the next decade, depending on how quickly cost declines are realized. But beyond just assuming that specific price and then increasing purchases from other systems to accommodate, so increasing energy purchases from both the gas plants that TriState currently operates and from the market at prices that TriState currently pays, we didn't specifically assign, where those purchases came from. There's a question about how did we think about increased emissions from increased startup and shutdown of gas-fired power plants to meet the ramping needs of renewables. And then there's a separate question about did we count for the emissions from purchases? So for the first question, we did not specifically account for the increased costs of ramping for new or existing gas-fired assets. We reviewed comprehensive studies put out by equipment manufacturers, national labs, and then independent consultancies that indicated that those additional ramping costs were often included in the integration cost estimates that utilities put forth to essentially account for the increasing cost of variability on their system. So we did account for that integration cost. It was spread across the whole fleet. We didn't explicitly assign that cost to specific assets that we assumed would need to ramp up or down, but we did account for the total cost. We also did account for the emissions associated with purchases. And we essentially used the average emissions rates from those systems that TriState is currently purchasing from as a proxy for the incremental emissions that would be associated with additional purchases. So the question here is, can you say more about resource availability with coal, wind, and solar? Why did you model coal providing the same peak capacity even with wind and solar coming online? So that's again referring to the chart that's on the screen right now. I guess the simplest answer is, in looking specifically at this chart, you can do three things with Escalante. You can keep it running the way it runs today, in which case you don't need to buy more wind and solar. You can keep it online, and it's a 247 megawatt power plant. You can't pay less and get 200 megawatts. So that's kind of a binary decision. So we kept, the second case, the fuel saver case, we kept it online, completely available to provide that peak capacity, but also procured wind and solar to reduce energy costs. And then in the retirement case, we just procured more wind and solar to provide more energy and then made up the difference on capacity to make up the full megawatts of Escalante. The other thing that is important to note here, and this came up in a question, is that I should actually go back to this slide here. So in addition to these utilities that I've noted on the slide that are making public notices of intent to procure renewables, TriState itself also released a request for proposals for new renewables projects. And to date, or at least as of the date of their press release responding to our report, has received over 10,000 megawatts of bids in response to their, I believe, 200 or 100 megawatt RFP for new projects. So kind of an order of 50 or 100 more bid capacity than was procured. And TriState is actively, again, according to their press release, considering moving forward with some of those projects. There's a question on what constraint did we use on solar and wind acquisition to meet but not exceed the utility's energy need. Yeah. Okay. Let me try to rephrase this question. Why did we only acquire up to the amount needed to serve TriState's load for wind and solar? So that is what we did. I guess the driver behind that decision of only in our energy transition case accounting for what is needed to meet TriState's load is a recognition that many utilities often seek to build or invest or incur debt only up to the point that is needed to serve their members' loads, and that anything above and beyond that is, gravy, but not necessarily justified by additional investment. That's not the business model of many of these utilities. So that was the rationale for that decision. There's a question about the timing of new transmission, and would that be an issue with this energy transition scenario? So again, we modeled the need and the cost for new transmission as part of procurement for new renewables. The question here is, did we allow enough lead time to build that new transmission? I think the best answer that we can give is likely yes, but we don't, again, have the definitive data that we would need to answer that 100% accurately, right? So we note through publicly available data that the wind and solar resources available in this region of the country are, and across, specifically TriState's footprint, are among the best in the country, and that TriState's transmission network is quite extensive across its footprint. And so, as Excel found in the Colorado Energy Plan, presumably there are many opportunities to connect with short gen-tie transmission lines, new projects to the high voltage backbone that TriState runs. We don't have the topology data or kind of the definitive power flow modeling to definitively say that that's the case. However, given what other utilities in this region have put forth, we would have to be convinced that TriState's system is fundamentally different for that to not be the case. So yeah, I think we did address that. There's a question about, did we accelerate the depreciation of any of the coal plants in our analysis? The short answer to that is no. We found that was not necessary. We found that an accelerated depreciation scheme that we considered would increase rates in the near term, by recovering more of that cost in the near term, but we didn't need to do that because the operational savings of, essentially just running coal plants less more than covered the existing debt payments on those assets. So we didn't think we needed to do that. And then on green site and shutdown costs, there was another question about, did we account for green site and shutdown costs? I think we did account for green site costs because we're using bid data, but I might be, if you want to follow up with me, the person that asked this question, I might need a little bit more context to answer that. And then on shutdown costs, we addressed that by looking at some benchmark studies, but I'd like to follow up with the person that asked this question to learn more about where you're coming from with this. So there's a question here. TriState's press release in response to these proposals was pretty dismissive. Could you respond to the objections that TriState raised? So yeah, the press release essentially said two things. The first was RMI doesn't have the data it needs to do this study. The second was TriState is already a leader in renewables. Both of those statements are true, right? Like, we don't have TriState's definitive data. However, we put a lot of effort into finding the best and most representative data that we could, based in this region with, in many cases, TriState's own public filings to back them up. So while we don't have the full suite of transmission topology, et cetera, that TriState itself has, we don't believe that our results are in any way incorrect because of that. There's a question about how do how does TriState and other G&Ts compare with investor-owned utilities, et cetera, on the level to which data that would be required to do this study with 100% accuracy are made available to the public? I guess that's probably a longer question than I want to go into in the short time we have left. I think in general, what's in the TriState IRP and in their 10K filing and their RUS 12 filing are helpful and indicative. They don't go into the level of detail that litigated proceedings do in Colorado and in other states. So I think that's a statement of fact. I'm not going to, comment on that in any way, but I think it's probably objectively true that less data are available to the general public as part of planning processes at many G&Ts, not just TriState, compared to investor-owned utilities. We'll do one more question. This one is about the revenue requirement slide. It shows a lower customer cost for the transition scenario than the business as usual scenario. Does that indicate that under an energy transition scenario, rates would be cheaper for customers using the forecast cost instead of the historical cost basis for customer rates? So I think the short answer is yes. So let me tell you what we did very clearly on this slide, so I'm very clear in answering this. These average rates that I'm showing here, 86 for the business as usual case and 77 for the base rate, those are the revenue requirement from members, so from distribution co-ops to TriState to continue operating TriState's business in this case study. Member co-ops generally pass those along, at cost to their end-use customers. So what the energy transition bar is showing here that's not elaborated is, if the current rate is 76 and the future rate is 77 under this scenario that we analyzed, that's essentially flat. In nominal dollars and real dollars, that's actually a significant decline in rates, just given the economics of new renewables in this region. Versus, a slight rise or flat in real terms for the base rate. If I'm not answering your question in detail, please follow up with me afterwards, and I'd be happy to chat. So with that, it's the top of the hour. I'm gonna call it here. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us and ask these questions. Please do follow up with me. My contact info is on this slide. As well as in the report, and my team would be happy to answer additional questions. So again, thank you.